Right now, the most sophisticated, extravagantly funded military apparatus in the history of human civilization is being actively paralyzed.
Yeah, and it's being paralyzed by drones that cost, like, what?
Mm.
About as much as a used Honda Civic.
Exactly. A used Civic and sea mines that look like they belong in a World War One museum.
It's wild.
It is wild. Meanwhile, over in Europe, you've got elite paratroopers who are reportedly uh, being forced to conduct their training exercises without actual airplanes.
Which is just, I mean, it sounds like a setup to a dystopian comedy.
Right, but it's not. All of this is happening just to satisfy an accounting spreadsheet.
It is the physical reality of the current global security landscape.
And it gets so much deeper than just, military logistical failures. Today, we are diving into this massive, incredibly dense stack of source material that basically proves the global military-industrial complex isn't broken at all.
No, not at all. It's
Huh.
just functioning as a very different kind of machine
Mm.
than the one we're constantly sold on the evening news.
Exactly. So for you listening, we're looking at a recent, highly candid panel discussion out of the Netherlands. And this panel features some serious heavy hitters, right? Like economists, geographers, financial journalists.
And what's so compelling about this specific panel is that they don't look at geopolitics through that traditional lens of political science or ideology.
Right.
They look at it through the lens of supply chains, macroeconomics, bureaucratic accounting.
It's the boring stuff that actually runs the world.
Exactly. They're examining the actual plumbing of the international order.
So our mission today is to follow that plumbing. We're going to connect the dots between those $4,000 drones in the Middle East, the hollowed-out, basically ghost armies of Europe, and the dark arts of defense accounting.
And we can't forget the wild political cover-up involving a fake medical diagnosis.
Oh man, that part is bonkers. But ultimately, we're going to show how a perpetual state of geopolitical crisis is being used to quietly unlock unprecedented access to, well, your genetic and digital data.
It is a monumental arc.
Yeah.
And what's vital to keep in mind for you, the listener, as we navigate this, is that this deep dive is fundamentally about separating the perception of power from the mechanics of power.
Right.
It's about looking past the soaring rhetoric of politicians and really examining the unglamorous technical legislation and the financial ledgers that are being manipulated in the background.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the panel starts by addressing the current conflict in the Middle East. And they frame it as this glaring, unavoidable wake-up call.
Yeah, because the United States and its allies entered this theater relying on their standard playbook.
Overwhelming, ultra-expensive, high-tech supremacy.
Exactly. But the results on the water are completely upending that playbook.
Right.
It all comes down to the brutal mathematics of asymmetric warfare.
Right.
The narrative we are accustomed to is that, if you spend billions on advanced Aegis destroyers, stealth capabilities, precision munitions,
You automatically dictate the terms of engagement.
right, you control the battlefield. But the sources highlight a stark reality playing out right now. Iran and its allied factions are not even attempting to meet the U.S. Navy with an equivalent multi-billion-dollar fleet.
They're entirely bypassing that paradigm. They're using what the panel describes as low-tech gear. Let's talk about those Shahed drones.
Yeah, the cost difference is staggering.
The panel notes these cost roughly $4,000 to produce. I really want to pause on that number. $4,000. You can barely buy like a high-end laptop and a decent coffee machine for that.
And they are using these things to paralyze naval operations.
How does that actually work mechanically? Why is it so paralyzing?
Well, the cost-exchange ratio is what's truly paralyzing. When a $4,000 drone is launched at a multi-billion-dollar destroyer, the destroyer's defense systems work exactly as intended.
Right, the radar tracks it.
Exactly. The computer calculates the intercept and fires a surface-to-air missile, say an SM-2 missile, to destroy the drone.
Okay, sounds like a win.
But the problem is that the SM-2 missile costs upwards of $2 million per shot.
Oh, wow. So you are spending $2 million to destroy a $4,000 piece of fiberglass and, like, a moped engine.
Precisely. You win the tactical engagement because the drone is destroyed, but you are losing the economic war at an unsustainable rate.
Because they can just keep sending them.
Right. The adversary can mass-produce those cheap drones in domestic factories using commercial off-the-shelf parts endlessly. A Western Navy cannot mass-produce $2 million precision interceptors endlessly.
Yeah, I mean, the magazines on the ships eventually just run empty.
And the supply chain to replenish those complex missiles takes years, not weeks.
And it's not just the drones playing this asymmetric game either. The panel brings up the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, that's one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. Millions of barrels of oil pass through there daily.
And how is it being threatened? Not by hypersonic missiles.
Right, by century-old, almost World War I style sea mines.
Sea mines are the ultimate asymmetric weapon. They sit at the bottom of the ocean, costing maybe a few $1,000s, and they project a massive area of denial.
And what the panel points out, which is genuinely shocking, is that the U.S. Navy, arguably the most well-funded fighting force in history, reportedly lacks the basic, rudimentary minesweepers required to efficiently clear that specific type of low-tech threat.
Yeah, it's a huge gap in capability.
Hold on, I have to push back on that a little. How does a Navy with aircraft carriers that cost like $13 billion apiece not have boats designed to scoop up old metal spheres from the water?
Because for the last 30 years, defense procurement has prioritized high-end, high-visibility, technologically complex platforms.
Stuff that looks good on camera.
Stuff that looks great on a spreadsheet and generates massive contracts for defense primes.
Yeah.
Sweeping for rudimentary acoustic or magnetic mines is slow, dangerous, unglamorous work. So the capacity for it was allowed to atrophy because planners just assumed future wars would be fought purely with high-end tech. The panel describes a real feeling of desperation setting in at the strategic level.
So it's like a billionaire showing up to a street fight with a diamond-encrusted sword, only to get chased off by a guy with a $4 slingshot.
That is exactly what it's like. It's the realization that having the most expensive hammer in the world doesn't help you if the problem requires a simple broom.
And then the billionaire demands his friends step in or he'll stop hanging out with them, right? Because this structural failure is causing massive political shockwaves.
Oh, definitely.
The sources point to Donald Trump making very aggressive statements recently, essentially threatening that if European allies don't step in and deploy their own navies to help manage this specific crisis, he sees a dark future for NATO.
He's demanding that Europe pull its weight, or the U.S. might just pack up its toys, leave the alliance, and go home.
But the experts in our source material completely invert that dynamic, don't they?
They do. They analyze Trump's threat and conclude that it is fundamentally a massive bluff.
A bluff. Okay, break the mechanics of that down for me. Because the assumption is always that Europe is the junior partner that desperately needs the U.S. security umbrella. Why does the panel think the U.S. is bluffing?
Because the panel argues that the United States secretly, structurally, needs Europe and the NATO alliance just as much, if not more, to maintain its own global hegemony.
Really?
Yeah. Ewald England, the geographer on the panel, points out that the U.S. hasn't spent the decade since the 1990s expanding NATO just out of the goodness of its heart. American economic and political interests are inextricably intertwined with European integration.
They mentioned something specific here, swap lines. Walk us through what that actually means in this context, because I feel like that's the invisible string holding all of this together.
Swap lines are basically the lifeblood of the global financial system.
Yep.
Essentially, they are agreements between central banks.
Yeah.
In this case, the U.S. Federal Reserve and the European Central
Okay.
Bank. In times of crisis, the Fed agrees to exchange U.S. dollars for euros to ensure that European banks have enough dollar liquidity to continue operating.
So they basically open a massive instantaneous credit line to keep the system from freezing up.
Correct, but it's not charity. By providing these swap lines, the U.S. ensures that the dollar remains the undisputed global reserve currency. If the U.S. were to abandon Europe militarily and politically, the financial cooperation would inevitably fracture. Europe might seek alternative financial architectures, perhaps aligning closer with Eastern blocs.
So the dollar's dominance depends on this.
Entirely. The panel argues that the U.S. dollar's dominance, which is what allows the U.S. to run massive deficits without hyperinflation, is entirely dependent on this transatlantic financial plumbing.
And it goes beyond just the central banks, right? The panel brings up big tech as well.
Absolutely. The digital infrastructure of Europe, cloud computing, data storage, search engines, social networks, all of that is overwhelmingly owned and operated by American monopolies.
Right, the Google and Amazon server farms. Exactly. This technological integration gives the United States a massive, unprecedented portal through which it exerts immense soft power, economic extraction, and intelligence gathering capabilities over European territory.
So if the U.S. were to actually dismantle NATO and withdraw its security guarantees,
European nations would be forced to aggressively pursue digital sovereignty. They'd have to kick out American tech firms.
so the U.S. wouldn't just be withdrawing troops, they would be severing the arteries of their own global economic and technological dominance.
Precisely. Therefore, the panel's blunt advice to European leaders hearing these threats from Washington is simply to ignore it, call the bluff.
Just ignore it. Wow.
Angelin argues that Europe should tell the U.S. to manage its own miscalculations with drones and sea mines in the Middle East, secure in the knowledge that the financial and structural ties are too valuable for the U.S. to ever actually sever.
I love how this completely reframes the power dynamic. It asks you to think about how often we just assume highest budget equals highest capability, which the sources thoroughly dismantle.
They absolutely dismantle it. But it leads us to a massive, looming question. Let's say Europe does want to help. Let's say they want to step up and project power to secure those maritime choke points. If the U.S. is struggling with the asymmetry of modern warfare, what exactly is the physical state of the European militaries they are calling upon?
Well, if you look at the physical reality rather than the political speeches, the situation in Europe, as depicted by these sources, is fundamentally hollowed out.
I mean, Grimm doesn't even begin to cover it. The panel literally refers to them as ghost armies. It's an illusion of force. Let's look at the specific case studies they provide because they are staggering. Let's start with the United Kingdom.
Okay.
The Royal Navy is one of the most legendary institutions in military history, but the sources paint a picture of a military that has essentially audited itself into absolute paralysis.
The UK is a prime example of what happens when financial spreadsheets dictate strategic capacity. Driven by severe budget cuts over the past couple of decades, the Royal Navy made the agonizing decision to retire its existing fleet of aircraft carriers, like the HMS Illustrious, long before their replacements were ready.
Why?
The logic was purely financial. Save the operational costs in the short term to afford the construction of the new massive carriers down the line.
Which, sounds like prudent financial planning. It's like selling your old car to save up for a down payment on a new one. But you can't just do that with a military force, can you?
No, because you create what military planners call a capability gap. But it's worse than just lacking a ship for a few years.
Yeah.
When the UK retired those carriers, they didn't just lose a piece of floating steel, they lost an entire generation of highly specialized personnel.
Right.
You lose the pilots who know how to land on a pitching deck at night. You lose the technicians who know how to maintain complex catapults and resting gear. You lose the institutional memory of how to orchestrate a carrier strike group.
The human capital just evaporated. They were fired, or they retired, or they moved to the private sector.
Exactly. Now, fast forward to today. The UK has successfully built two brand new, incredibly advanced, multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers, the HMS Queen Elizabeth and the HMS Prince of Wales.
Yeah.
But the sources note they are facing immense operational paralysis because they simply cannot find, train, and retain the crew to man them, nor the aircraft to put on them.
Because you threw away the legacy and the personnel.
Right, and you cannot simply spawn experienced naval aviators and specialized nuclear technicians overnight just because the new ship is finally painted.
That is the definition of a hollow force. And the UK's spreadsheet logic didn't stop with the Navy. The panel notes that despite a massive push to reorganize the military, the UK decided to cut its amphibious assault ships.
Yes, the specific vessels used to transport and deploy the Royal Marines.
Again, to save money. But the human cost was immediate, right?
It was devastating to morale.
Yeah.
The sources state that without the ships to actually deploy them, the Royal Marines began resigning en masse.
It's quitting.
Yeah. These are elite soldiers who looked at the situation and realized their core strategic function had been eliminated by an accountant. They were essentially stranded.
But the absolute peak of this absurdity, the detail from the transcript that genuinely made me stop and reread it, is what happened to the British paratroopers.
Oh, this part.
So they don't have the amphibious ships to go by sea. The logical alternative for rapid deployment is going by air. But to meet budget constraints, the UK military retired the C-130 Hercules transport planes used by the paratroopers.
It reads like a satire of bureaucratic incompetence.
Yeah.
But according to the panel, it is the physical reality. The paratroopers are now forced to conduct their training exercises without planes.
How does a paratrooper train without a plane? Are they just jumping off tall walls?
They use suspended harnesses, static towers, and virtual simulations. But as the panel points out, they are parachutists who cannot fly. The UK is an island nation. Without operational amphibious transport ships and without heavy airlift transport planes, their rapid reaction forces are effectively trapped on their own island.
Trapped.
The aggressively hawkish war rhetoric coming from British politicians is completely dangerously disconnected from the physical, logistical capacity of their armed forces to project power beyond their own borders.
Okay, so that's the UK. An island fortress with no boats and no planes. Let's cross the channel and look at a mainland nation. The panel tears into former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte for his handling of the military. What was his spreadsheet maneuver?
What's fascinating here is how blunt it was. The sources detail how, during a period of intense budget austerity following the 2008 financial crisis, Rutte effectively disbanded the entire Dutch heavy tank brigade.
Just disbanded entirely.
And he didn't just quietly phase the equipment out over time. The panel specifically mentions that he essentially sent a letter firing the personnel.
Just, thanks for your service, please turn in your Leopard 2, you're out of a job.
Quite literally. The Netherlands sold off its entire inventory of heavy battle tanks to countries like Finland and Turkey.
Unbelievable.
So the heavy armor capability, a cornerstone of Cold War land defense, was just erased from the ledger to save money. But the panel makes a crucial point here. It's not just the hardware that is missing in Europe. It is the manpower, and more specifically, the legal framework governing that manpower.
Right, the labor laws. This was the part of the transcript that completely broke my brain. We think of the military as this separate entity, but they are employees.
This is a vital detail that almost always gets overlooked in grand strategic geopolitical discussions. Modern European labor laws, designed to protect workers' rights and quality of life, apply to soldiers as well.
Okay.
The sources point out that under current Dutch military regulations, a soldier cannot be deployed away from their home base for more than 6 months at a time.
Which, if you're a civilian, sounds incredibly humane and reasonable. You wouldn't want to be forced away from your family for a year.
It is entirely humane. But mathematically and logistically, it creates a massive structural hurdle for projecting military force. Arno Wellens, the journalist on the panel, breaks down the math.
Yeah, please break this down.
He explains that because of this strict 6-month legal limit, you have to divide your total on-paper military capacity by 4 to understand your actual deployable operational readiness.
I need you to walk me through that math very slowly. Why divide by 4? Why isn't it just dividing by 2? If they're gone for 6 months, shouldn't you just need 2 groups to cover a year?
Let's trace the cycle of a single unit. Imagine you want to deploy 1 frigate or 1 infantry battalion to a conflict zone and keep a continuous presence there for a year.
Okay, I'm following.
First, you send Unit A. They are deployed for their legal maximum of 6 months. To ensure the mission doesn't collapse when Unit A leaves, you need Unit B fully prepared and ready to immediately rotate in and replace them for the next 6 months.
Right, so that's 2 units.
However, you can't just have Unit B sitting around doing nothing. Before they deploy, they must be in an intensive, active training cycle for months to prepare for the specific mission.
Okay.
So that's your 3rd unit, the one currently training to be the replacement's replacement.
Okay, that makes sense. So where does the 4th come in?
Finally, you absolutely must have a 4th unit held in reserve at home. This is your emergency contingency. If a crisis erupts somewhere else in the world, or if Unit A takes casualties and needs immediate reinforcement, you cannot send the unit that just got back. And you cannot send the unit that is still in basic training.
You need a dedicated, fully rested reserve.
Exactly. Therefore, to keep 1 single ship at sea, or 1 battalion on a border, permanently, you need the personnel, the equipment, and the budget for 4 ships or battalions.
That is staggering.
And as the panel highlights, if you look at a country like Belgium, they currently only have 2 operational frigates, both dating back to the 1980s. Divide 2 by 4. They do not even possess the mathematical capacity to maintain a single continuous naval deployment. The numbers on the spreadsheet do not translate to reality.
And the manpower to fill even those diminished numbers simply doesn't exist. The panel mentions that the salaries and living conditions for regular enlisted soldiers are terrible. A sergeant can barely afford basic civilian housing, let alone support a family. So recruiting is entirely stagnant.
Right.
But this brings us to a massive, glaring contradiction, and this is the pivot point of the whole deep dive. If these armies are this gutted, if the UK is trapped on an island, if the Dutch sold their tanks, if the Belgians can't deploy a ship and the troops are underpaid, how on earth are all these European nations suddenly celebrating hitting these massive new NATO spending targets?
That's a great question.
Right. We see headlines every day about countries finally reaching the 2% of GDP target, or even talking about pushing it to 3% or 5%. If the money isn't going to soldiers and it isn't going to gear they can use today, where is it going?
And that profound contradiction leads us directly into the dark, incredibly opaque art of defense accounting.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if you think corporate accounting is full of loopholes and creative math, government defense accounting operates on a completely different plane of reality.
The sources provide a very specific, highly technical explanation for how this illusion of rearmament is being maintained without actually improving readiness. They point to a specific European accounting rule known as ESA 2010.
ESA 2010.
And within that massive bureaucratic framework, they highlight Stipulation 3.129b.
Stipulation 3.129b. I love that the panel gets into the actual footnotes of European bureaucracy because that's where the real power lies. What exactly does this rule dictate?
This rule dictates how governments are legally required to log large capital expenditures on their national balance sheets. In the context of the military, if a government decides it needs to upgrade its air force and signs a contract to buy a massive piece of hardware, say like a squadron of F-35 fighter jets from Lockheed Martin,
Okay.
they do not put that massive cost on the official books at the moment they sign the contract, nor when they transfer the initial funds. According to ESA 2010, the expense only hits the official books and thus counts toward their NATO GDP target when the item is physically delivered and ownership is transferred.
Okay, but building a fifth-generation stealth fighter like the F-35 isn't like ordering a package online. That takes a massive amount of time.
Exactly. The supply chains are incredibly complex. It can take 5, 10, or even 15 years from the initial order to the actual delivery of a functional squadron.
So let's look at the political reality. European politicians are under immense immediate pressure right now from Washington, from NATO command, from the media, to show that they are spending 2% of their GDP today.
Yep.
But the accounting rules say they can't claim the credit for buying a jet until 2035. How do they solve that temporal paradox?
The panel describes a scenario that essentially invites systemic mismanagement and structural corruption. To get the cash out the door and appease the NATO quotas now, governments are forced into bizarre, highly inefficient procurement behaviors.
Like what?
They are desperately prepaying manufacturers massive sums of money up front. But because the governments are the ones desperate to allocate the funds to look good politically, they do so from a position of profound weakness.
Oh, I see.
They hand over the money without holding the defense contractors accountable for the inevitable delays and cost overruns. The panel explicitly mentions programs like the F-35 facing years of chronic delays, yet the money keeps slowing.
The governments are essentially throwing billions at defense primes, saying, here is our budget, please take it so we look committed to NATO and deliver the goods whenever you get around to it.
It's absolute insanity.
If I can use an analogy, it's like a guy panic buying gem equipment on January 1st to prove to his spouse that he is finally taking his health seriously. He drops $10,000 on a super advanced custom-built treadmill. He shows her the receipt.
Right.
But the catch is, the treadmill is back-ordered and won't be delivered to his house until 2035. And to pay for this invisible future treadmill, he has to cut his actual grocery budget today. He looks incredibly committed on paper, but physically he is actually getting weaker.
That analogy perfectly captures the macroeconomic reality the panel is outlining. They note that governments are specifically not increasing the salaries of the actual personnel, the grocery budget in your analogy.
Right, because paying a sergeant a living wage counts as immediate operational expenditure.
Exactly. They need to funnel all available capital into these massive, delayed, capital-intensive hardware purchases to try and manipulate the long-term accounting ledgers.
But wait, if those big F-35 purchases don't count toward the 2% target until delivery, how are they artificially inflating the numbers to hit the 2% right now?
Through a mechanism the panel describes as defense arbitrage. This is where it ceases to be about military strategy and becomes a pure, cynical numbers game.
Okay, how does that work?
The sources explain that countries are dragging completely obsolete museum-era equipment out of deep storage. The specific example provided is the Leopard 1 tank.
Okay, for context, the Leopard 1 is a tank that was designed in the 1960s. Its armor is paper-thin by modern standards. There are no active production lines for its parts or its ammunition anymore. It is a relic.
It is entirely obsolete for modern combined arms warfare against a peer adversary. But European nations take these relics out of storage warehouses, dust them off, and donate them to Ukraine.
Okay.
And then here's the accounting magic trick. They do not log the scrap value of a 60-year-old piece of metal. They log the replacement value of a brand new, state-of-the-art modern equivalent on their defense spending ledgers.
You have got to be kidding me.
It's an accounting fiction.
Yes.
They artificially inflate their current defense spending by assigning massive 2024 current market values to junk they were never ever going to use anyway.
Wow.
This arbitrage allows them to instantly cross the 2% threshold on paper, pleasing Donald Trump, silencing critics at NATO headquarters, and projecting an image of rearmament without actually improving their own immediate combat readiness by a single soldier or a single modern weapon system.
That is essentially institutional fraud. But surely if every single country in Europe suddenly starts ordering new tanks, new drones, and new artillery shells with this massive influx of panicked cash, that's going to cause a massive bottleneck in the supply chain, right? Factories can only build so fast.
Absolutely, and that is the catastrophic economic consequence. The panel cites a detailed report from the Clydesdale Institute, a prominent Dutch think tank, which models this exact macroeconomic problem. They term it a production infarct.
An infarct, like a heart attack, a blockage in the system.
Precisely. You have dozens of European countries, all driven by the same political panic and the same accounting deadlines, suddenly unleashing a fire hose of sovereign debt and taxpayer cash. And all of that money is chasing the exact same, highly limited, inelastic factory output. You cannot just build a new tank factory in a week. The supply curve is rigid.
So it's economics 101, a massive artificial demand shock hitting a fixed, limited supply.
The inevitable mathematical result is skyrocketing, hyper-localized inflation within the defense sector. The sources state that the price of basic military hardware, a tank, an artillery shell, a drone, is suddenly multiplying. In some cases, systems are costing 10 times more than they did just a few years prior.
So taxpayers are pouring billions of additional euros into the national defense budget.
But because the cost of the hardware has ballooned by a factor of 10 due to this artificial demand shock, the actual physical amount of security being purchased remains exactly the same, or in many cases, actually diminishes.
So the government spends 10 times the money to buy the exact same number of tanks.
It is a massive, highly regressive wealth transfer from the public treasury to the shareholders of defense contractors, and it delivers zero extra security to the citizen today.
Okay, let me try to synthesize this entire journey so far because it is incredibly dense. The physical military isn't ready, the troops are underpaid and legally restricted from sustained deployments. The navies lack the basic ships to counter $4,000 drones.
Yeah.
The new high-tech gear doesn't exist yet and won't for a decade, and the gear that does exist is wildly overpriced due to a panicked artificial demand surge driven by countries using accounting tricks with museum scrap to hit an arbitrary 2% spreadsheet target.
That is a bleak systemic reality the panel has diagnosed.
But that reality raises a massive, unavoidable question. If the spending spree is creating economic chaos, if it's causing inflation, draining public coffers, and not actually making anyone safer today, what is the justification? How are politicians successfully selling this massive generational restructuring of the economy to the voting public?
They are selling it through a relentless, unified narrative of imminent existential threat. Specifically, the threat of a conventional territorial Russian invasion of NATO territory within the next 3 to 5 years.
Right. That is the drumbeat we hear every single day on the evening news from every major political leader. But the sources we are analyzing today, they push back extremely hard against this narrative, don't they?
They do, and they do so aggressively. The panel heavily questions the validity of the Russian threat narrative being used to justify these emergency budget hikes. And they don't do it from a position of political sympathy. They approach it from a strictly macroeconomic and logistical perspective.
I really want you to walk us through their argument here, because questioning that specific threat timeline is considered pretty taboo in mainstream geopolitical discourse right now.
Yeah.
How do they justify their skepticism?
The panel's argument is rooted in objective, measurable data regarding state capacity. They point out that Russia, despite its vast geography and nuclear arsenal, is fundamentally a middle-income country. If you look at the sheer size of the Russian GDP, the panel notes it is roughly comparable to the Benelux countries combined, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, or perhaps the economy of Spain or Italy.
I have to push back here. The idea that Russia is just a middle-income country completely ignores their massive state-directed artillery production capabilities right now. They are churning out shells at a rate that dwarfs the West. How does the panel actually justify waving that away?
The panel doesn't deny their current artillery production for the localized conflict in Ukraine. What they're arguing against is the capacity for a sustained, conventional, continent-wide war against the entirety of the NATO alliance.
Oh, I see the distinction.
The panel argues that an economy the size of Spain's simply lacks the deep industrial base, the advanced technological supply chains, and the financial endurance to wage a multi-front war across Europe.
Because they're looking at the logistics.
Exactly. They point to the logistical reality on the ground. Russia has struggled immensely to occupy and hold 20% of Ukrainian territory right on its own immediate border, utilizing massive amounts of its legacy Soviet stockpile to do so.
Right.
The idea that this same military logistics chain is currently preparing to launch a blitzkrieg across Poland, Germany, and the Baltics is, to the panel, logistically and economically absurd. Furthermore, they note that even in its currently hollowed-out, inefficient state, the combined conventional arsenals, air power, and defense budgets of European NATO countries already vastly outnumber what Russia possesses.
Okay, I see the macroeconomic argument, but what about the intelligence reports? We're constantly told by defense ministers that highly classified military intelligence anticipates a direct attack in the next 3 to 5 years. We have to trust the experts who see the raw data, right?
Well, the panel actually dissects one of these major intelligence reports, the Klingdiel report.
Yes, and this is where the panel's critique shifts from macroeconomics to the actual methodology of how these threat assessments are generated and sold to the public.
Exactly. The panel examines the methodology of that Klingdiel report, which is frequently cited by politicians as the objective scientific proof of this looming 3 to 5 year threat.
Right.
But Ewald Engelin, the geographer, points out a massive structural flaw in how the report generates its conclusions. He argues it is not an intelligence assessment, it is an economic phenomenon. He compares the report's methodology to the concept of a Keynesian beauty contest.
Okay, we need to break down the Keynesian beauty contest because that is a brilliant concept. How does that work?
In the 1930s, the economist John Maynard Keynes described a popular newspaper contest. Readers were presented with 100 photographs of faces and had to choose the 6 prettiest.
Okay, simple enough.
The winner of the contest, the person who won the cash prize, was the reader whose 6 choices most closely matched the average preferences of all the other competitors. Keynes pointed out that to win this game, you shouldn't pick the faces that you genuinely find the prettiest. That's a losing strategy. You should pick the faces you think other people will find prettiest. And if everyone is thinking that way, you have to go a level deeper. You pick the faces that you think other people will find prettiest.
So you were completely removed from objective reality. You weren't judging beauty at all. You are just predicting the consensus of the herd.
Exactly. It becomes a closed loop of self-referential anticipation. Engelin argues the Klingdiel threat assessment is functioning exactly like a Keynesian beauty contest.
How so?
It doesn't base its timeline for a Russian invasion on objective, verifiable data like satellite imagery of new tank factories, raw economic indicators, or logistical supply line analysis. Instead, the report relies heavily on surveys and interviews.
Interviews with who?
With NATO officials, military commanders, think tank analysts, and defense industry stakeholders.
Oh, wow.
The report essentially surveys a group of people who have a direct, vested financial, professional, and bureaucratic interest in securing higher defense budgets. They asked this specific group, do you think we need higher defense budgets to face a looming threat?
And shocker, they say yes.
Unsurprisingly, the consensus of these interviews is that a massive existential threat is indeed looming in exactly 3 to 5 years, which, conveniently, is the exact procurement timeline needed to justify immediate, massive budget increases.
The panel argues this is a feedback loop, not objective intelligence. It's an echo chamber reproducing the desires and financial necessities of the military-industrial complex, disguised as empirical science.
That's exactly their point.
That is a staggering claim. They are basically saying the threat assessment is a self-fulfilling prophecy designed to secure funding. The system is investigating itself and finding that it needs more money.
Yep.
But if you think that methodological critique is controversial, the sources take a hard left turn into a story that honestly sounds like it was written for a late-night political soap opera. It's a story about how the Russian threat narrative wasn't just exaggerated by think tanks, but was literally, explicitly fabricated by the highest levels of government to cover up a domestic sex scandal in the Netherlands.
This is undoubtedly the most explosive, bizarre, and highly specific anecdote presented in the transcript. And before we dive into the mechanics of it, it is important to clarify our role here.
Right.
As analysts of this source material, our job is not to verify the absolute legal truth of these specific, highly personal allegations. Rather, We're looking at how the panel uses this intricate story to illustrate a profound systemic loss of trust in the geopolitical narratives being fed to the public by the political class.
Fair enough. We are exploring the panel's argument, not endorsing it. But the story itself, as laid out by Arno Wellens on the panel, is absolutely wild. It centers around a former Dutch foreign minister named Halbe Zijlstra. Set the stage for us.
For context, several years ago, during a period of escalating tensions, Halbe Zijlstra made a highly publicized claim. He stated publicly that he had been present in a dacha, a Russian country house, with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Zijlstra claimed he personally heard Putin outline grand, imperialistic, expansionist plans to recreate a greater Russia, explicitly threatening neighboring European states.
Right. And this personal anecdote from a sitting foreign minister was widely cited across European media as primary, undeniable evidence of Putin's immediate intent to invade Europe.
It was the smoking gun.
Yeah.
Except it was a complete lie.
Yes. Zijlstra eventually had to publicly admit that he was never in the dacha, he never met Putin in that context, and he never heard Putin say those things. He resigned in disgrace over the fabrication.
But the panelist, Arno Wellens, claims the lie goes much, much deeper than just a single politician exaggerating his resume to look tough. He claims the dacha lie was the final act of a hastily constructed multi-layered cover-up orchestrated by Prime Minister Mark Rutte.
Okay, so according to the source, what was Rutte trying to cover up?
Wellens alleges that Zijlstra was never supposed to be the foreign minister. The original choice for the position was a different politician named Han ten Broek. However, shortly before taking office, it was discovered that ten Broek had engaged in an affair with a much younger subordinate staffer. According to the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism, the specific nature and power dynamic of this affair made ten Broek chantable.
Chantable, meaning susceptible to blackmail, which makes sense. A blackmailable foreign minister is a massive, walking national security risk. Intelligence agencies look for exactly that kind of leverage.
Exactly. So according to the panel's narrative, Rutte was informed of the security risk. He needed to quickly pull ten Broek from the foreign minister position. But he couldn't explain the real scandalous reason to the public because it would cause a massive political embarrassment for his party right as a new government was forming.
Ah, so they needed a cover story.
Right. To explain ten Broek's sudden, unexpected withdrawal from the prominent role, the government allegedly invented a fake medical condition. They announced that ten Broek had suddenly developed a rare neurovascular condition that prevented him from flying or handling the intense stress of serving as foreign minister.
Convenient.
However, conveniently, this debilitating condition still allowed him to sit quietly as a regular backbench member of parliament.
It's the classic stepping down to spend more time with my family excuse, but weaponized with medical terminology. And the only reason they got caught in this elaborate medical lie is because of the most random, absurd coincidence ever.
Yes. Wellens claims that at the exact time this news broke, he happened to be dating a medical doctor whose specific, highly specialized field of expertise was neurovascular conditions.
You literally cannot write this stuff. It's too on the nose.
When the government publicly announced ten Broek's diagnosis and described the limitations it placed on him, this specialist doctor allegedly looked at the symptoms described in the press and told Wellens they are lying. That condition doesn't work like that. The symptoms and the restrictions they are describing are medically contradictory.
Wow.
The panelist claims Rutte literally just opened a medical encyclopedia, picked a disease that sounded complicated and serious enough that political journalists wouldn't dare question it, and assigned it to ten Broek to hide the sex scandal.
And because ten Broek was suddenly out, they had a massive hole in the cabinet. They had to rush Halbe Zijlstra into the foreign minister role. But Zijlstra had zero foreign policy experience. He had no credibility on the international stage.
Right.
So to manufacture that credibility instantly, they invented the story about him hanging out with Putin in the dacha.
That is the sequence of events and the chain of cause and effect as alleged by the source.
I want to synthesize the implication of this because it is staggering. We are talking about restructuring the entire European economy. We are talking about diverting hundreds of billions of euros away from housing, away from healthcare, away from education, and pouring it into defense contractors based on a timeline of imminent war.
Yes.
And the people demanding we do this based on their classified intelligence are the exact same people who, according to this panel, couldn't even successfully fake a medical note without getting busted by a local radiologist.
And that is the core devastating argument the panel is making. It's not just an argument about a single lie. It's an argument about systemic credibility. The journalist, Wellens, posits a crucial question. If these politicians and bureaucratic managers are willing to fabricate complex, high-stakes stories involving foreign adversaries simply to manage a domestic PR problem and hide an affair, how can the public possibly trust their classified, unverifiable assertions that a massive, continent-wide war is imminent?
The panel argues that the threat environment is largely manufactured, or at least heavily exaggerated, by a political class that has lost all connection to truth and accountability.
Exactly.
But this brings us to the darkest, most concerning part of the entire deep dive. If the foreign threat is exaggerated, if the armies are physically hollow and the money is just vanishing into accounting black holes for gear that won't arrive for a decade, what is all this crisis momentum actually being used for? What is the real immediate goal if it's not actually preparing to fight a ground war in 3 years?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources suggest a motivation that is far more insidious than simple financial corruption. The most alarming claim in this deep dive is that the overarching atmosphere of geopolitical fear, the perpetual state of crisis, is functioning as a Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse for what?
For passing, sweeping, highly invasive domestic surveillance, data control, and financial regulations that the public would never, ever accept during normal times of peace and democratic deliberation. The panel argues that the true target of this militarization isn't necessarily a foreign army massing on the border. The target is the domestic population.
This is where the transcript gets genuinely terrifying because it moves from abstract geopolitics into our literal biology. They zero in on a specific piece of pending Dutch legislation. It's called the Wet op Defensiereiheid, the Defense Readiness Law.
Yes. The panel points to a very specific, highly technical clause buried within this proposed law, Article 4.5. The stated public justification for this entire law is that in a time of severe escalating geopolitical tension, the military must be granted the flexibility to conduct realistic military training.
Which, on its face, sounds perfectly reasonable. If the world is dangerous, you want your military to train realistically. You don't want them training on trampolines.
It sounds entirely reasonable until you read the fine print of what Article 4.5 actually authorizes the state to do under the vague, unchallengeable guise of realistic training.
Right.
The source details how this pending law would legally authorize the Defense Ministry to process highly sensitive, constitutionally protected personal data of ordinary civilian citizens.
And we aren't just talking about your name, your address, or your license plate number. We are talking about the deepest, most private, fundamental aspects of a human being. The panel lists it out, and it's chilling.
It really is.
The law explicitly allows the processing of data revealing race, ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership. And it gets worse.
It does. It explicitly authorizes the military to process genetic data, biometric data for the purpose of uniquely identifying a person, and data concerning health, a person's sex life, or sexual orientation.
I need you to explain the mechanism here because I cannot fathom a logical connection. Why on earth does the military need to know my genetic code, my biometric facial geometry, or my sexual orientation so they can practice driving a tank or simulating a border defense?
The panel argues there is absolutely no legitimate conventional military reason. It does not help a soldier fire a rifle. However, the law is written with intentional massive loopholes.
Like what?
It states that this deeply personal data can be processed if the defense minister simply deems it unavoidable or necessary for the broad, undefined goal of defense readiness. And here is the crucial legal mechanism. Because it is framed entirely as a matter of supreme national security, this data processing explicitly bypasses the standard European privacy protections.
You mean the GDPR? The General Data Protection Regulation? The thing that makes me click accept cookies 1,000 times a day on every website? The law that's supposed to be the gold standard for global privacy.
Exactly. The GDPR has a national security exemption. When a government declares a crisis and frames data collection as vital for defense readiness, the GDPR ceases to apply. The constitutional protections that usually shield your private life are suspended.
Unbelievable.
Furthermore, the Defense Readiness Law allows the Dutch minister to share this incredibly sensitive, aggregated, personal biometric and political data with their NATO partners, including the intelligence apparatus of the United States.
So they have built a legal backdoor to harvest everything about you, utilizing fear of a foreign enemy to suspend domestic privacy laws. But what is the actual technological endgame here? They are gathering genetic data, tracking political views. What system are they feeding this into? What do they plan to actually do with it?
Well, the panelist Arno Wellens connects this legal data harvesting, to two very specific, massive technological developments occurring simultaneously in Europe.
Okay.
First, Project GaiaX. This is a massive European initiative aimed at creating a unified, federated cloud infrastructure and a health data space. The stated goal is to link all aspects of a citizen's life, medical records, financial history, government ID, into a single, interoperable digital passport.
Which, again, they sell as convenience. You'll never have to fill out a form at the doctor's office again. It sounds great until you realize who is building the architecture and who has access to the passport.
Precisely. And that leads to the second, much darker connection the panel makes, Palantir. The sources note that Palantir, a highly controversial American data analytics and artificial intelligence company deeply tied to the intelligence community, is heavily involved in building these European digital identity projects.
The panel highlights the cognitive dissonance here. Palantir is the exact same company that develops software platforms, like Palantir Gotham, which are utilized by the military for automated, AI-driven drone warfare, predictive policing, and target identification.
Yes.
Wait, stop. Let's make sure we are connecting these mechanisms clearly. You are taking an AI software system designed to help military drones identify, categorize, and eliminate targets on a battlefield.
Right.
And you are integrating that exact same algorithmic architecture with a civilian digital passport database that contains the genetic markers, the political views, the biometric facial scans, and the health data of your own domestic population.
That is the overarching architecture the panel believes is being quietly constructed under the radar. They point out that several European healthcare organizations and tech companies initially balked at working with Palantir on the digital passport project due to massive ethical and privacy concerns.
But they did it anyway.
But integration proceeded anyway, driven by state mandates. The argument is that the state is utilizing the excuse of an external foreign threat to build a domestic database that allows for total algorithmic surveillance, categorization, and potential restriction of its own citizens.
It's the ultimate bait and switch. You think you're cheering for defense funding to build artillery shells to protect the borders from a foreign invasion, but you're actually funding a server farm that logs your genetics and political opinions so an AI can analyze your behavior.
And the financial mechanism making this entire architecture possible is also a massive bait and switch. The panel brings up the European Corona Recovery Fund.
Right, the 800 billion euro fund, the money that was supposed to save the economy during the pandemic lockdowns, clapping for the healthcare heroes.
Exactly. It was a massive, unprecedented borrowing initiative justified entirely by the public health emergency of the pandemic.
Yep.
The public accepted the massive debt because they believed it was going to hospitals, vaccine research, and small business relief.
Right.
But the sources argue that, in reality, almost none of that 800 billion euros actually went to frontline healthcare workers or structural medical improvements. Instead, as the pandemic faded from the headlines, that massive pool of funds was seamlessly transitioned by the bureaucracy.
Transitioned how?
It was quietly rebranded as a Readiness and Resilience Fund. And the panel claims it is now being funneled directly into building this exact digital identity infrastructure and covering the accounting black holes of military procurement.
They argue it was always a long-term plan by the European Commission to pool European debt to build these centralized control systems. The pandemic and the subsequent war are simply the sequential, convenient excuses used to justify the spending to the public without ever having a genuine democratic debate about the endgame. So they've built a back door to your genetic data and your political views under the guise of military readiness. But to have total algorithmic surveillance, knowing who you are and what you think isn't enough. They need to know what you buy. They need to control your capacity to transact.
Yes.
And that brings us to the final section of our source material, which explains how this desire for strategic autonomy is targeting the actual money in your wallet.
Right. We move from the militarization of data to the militarization of finance. The push for the digital euro, or a central bank digital currency, a CBDC.
The sources explain that the European Commission is aggressively selling the concept of a digital euro to the public. And the marketing pitch is, once again, strategic autonomy.
Always the same pitch.
The argument they make is that Europe currently relies far too heavily on American credit card monopolies like Visa and MasterCard to process daily mundane transactions. The politicians argue that if the U.S. ever gets angry and decides to cut Europe off from those networks, the entire European economy stops instantly. Therefore, Europe needs its own sovereign digital currency to protect itself.
But the economist on the panel, Lex Hugdwin, systematically dismantles that specific justification. He approaches it from a purely functional macroeconomic perspective.
Okay, what does he say?
He points out that if the genuine goal is simply to have a European payment system that is independent of Visa or MasterCard, the private sector is already solving that problem perfectly well.
He mentions existing systems like Wero, right?
Yes, Wero, a European banking initiative, or the rapid development of private euro-backed stablecoins on blockchain networks. The technology to process digital payments domestically without relying on American rails already exists and is functioning. A highly centralized central bank digital euro is completely unnecessary to achieve that specific stated goal.
So if we don't need a CBDC to process payments at the grocery store, why is the central bank so absolutely desperate to implement it?
Because a CBDC is not just a digital version of cash. It is a fundamentally different technology that offers unprecedented control. Hugduin outlines two massive systemic dangers inherent to a CBDC. The first is the concept of programmable money.
Programmable money.
Unlike a physical paper euro, or even the digital euros currently sitting in your traditional bank database, a CBDC issued directly by the central bank can be programmed via smart contracts to dictate exactly how, where, and when it is spent.
Give me a practical example of how that programmability changes my life.
The state could, theoretically, program your money so that it cannot be used to buy a plane ticket if the system determines you've exceeded your assigned carbon allowance for the month.
Oh, wow.
It could be programmed so it cannot be used to buy red meat. It could be geofenced so you can only spend it within a 5-mile radius of your home to enforce a lockdown.
That's insane.
Or, most insidiously, the money could be programmed with an expiration date. If you don't spend it within 30 days to stimulate the economy, it simply vanishes from your wallet.
So in a CBDC system, your money ceases to be your private sovereign property. It becomes a conditional voucher granted by the state, contingent on your ongoing compliance with their behavioral metrics.
Precisely.
That is terrifying. It links perfectly with the Palantir database we just talked about. If the AI knows your political views and your biometric identity, it can instantly shut off your programmable money if you dissent. But Hugduin mentions a second danger, a purely economic one.
The enforcement of deeply negative interest rates.
Walk us through the math and the psychology of negative interest rates.
In a traditional banking system, central banks lower interest rates to stimulate borrowing and spending.
Yeah.
But there is a concept called the zero lower bound.
Okay.
If a bank lowers interest rates below zero, meaning they literally charge you a penalty fee just to keep your own money in your savings account, you have an escape hatch. You can simply go to the ATM, withdraw your life savings in physical paper cash, and hide it under your mattress.
Physical cash protects your wealth from negative rates because it holds its nominal value.
Exactly. The mattress is the ultimate defense against central bank overreach.
Right.
But in a fully digital CBDC system where physical cash is deliberately phased out and criminalized, that escape hatch is welded shut. You have no physical alternative.
So you're trapped.
If the economy is sluggish, the central bank can implement a negative 3% or 5% interest rate, and your life savings will simply evaporate from your digital wallet month by month. You're forced to spend it on things you don't need or watch it disappear.
The panel calls this exactly what it is, a forced, inescapable tax on savings, or state-mandated theft.
Yes.
And the panel uses this brilliant, evocative metaphor to describe how all of this, the ghost armies, the data harvesting, the digital money happens. It doesn't happen through a sudden, violent revolution. It happens through camel nosing.
Yes, the Moroccan proverb. It says that if you are in the desert and you allow a camel to stick just its nose into your tent to get warm, you might think it's harmless. But soon the head follows, then the neck, and before long, the entire massive camel is inside the tent, crushing you and eating your couscous.
The panel argues that both the military-industrial complex and the digital surveillance state operate exactly like this. They don't ask for total authoritarian control all at once. They start with a small, seemingly harmless, perfectly logical nose.
We just need a digital health pass to travel safely during a pandemic. That's the nose.
Right.
We just need a small digital Euro pilot program for interbank wholesale transfers. That's the nose. We just need a slight increase in the defense budget to send some old tanks to Ukraine. That's the nose.
We just need to collect some biometric data to ensure realistic military training. That is the nose.
Exactly.
But once the nose is in, the bureaucracy expands, the legal precedents are set, the funding structures become permanent, and before you know it, the entire camel is in the tent. You have a massive, unaccountable military apparatus that cannot be dismantled. and an omnipotent surveillance state processing your genetic data.
And the camel is eating the public budget. The hundreds of billions of euros that were supposed to go to affordable housing, functional healthcare, and education are simply gone, absorbed by the beast.
So, how does the panel bring all of these disparate threads together? They conclude by reflecting on a profound, haunting warning from the past. They cite President Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous Cross of Iron speech from 1953.
And the context of Eisenhower is so important here. He wasn't some naive pacifist academic. He was the supreme Allied commander during World War II. He orchestrated D-Day. He knew the absolute necessity and the horrifying reality of industrial warfare better than anyone.
And yet, as president, sitting at the pinnacle of global power, he issued the starkest warning against the very entity he helped build. The entity he would later famously name the military-industrial complex. The panel recalls his specific words.
Yeah, it's a powerful quote.
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children.
He understood fundamentally that true national security isn't just about stockpiling weapons. It's about the health, the cohesion, and the prosperity of the society you are supposedly protecting. If you bankrupt the society to build the weapons, you've already lost the war from the inside.
The panel's core unyielding thesis is that modern Europe is actively, willfully ignoring Eisenhower's warning. They are engaging in a massive, panic-driven transfer of generational wealth toward an unaccountable military and digital infrastructure.
They are doing so justified by threat narratives that are highly questionable and methodologically flawed. And the ultimate result is the construction of technological and legal systems that threaten to destroy the very liberties and democratic values they claim to be defending.
Wow. We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today, and I want to summarize the arc of this journey. We started by looking at the physical reality of the Strait of Hormuz, where $4,000 drones are paralyzing billion-dollar navies, exposing the catastrophic asymmetry and supply chain fragility of modern warfare.
We moved from there to the physical decay of European militaries, the ghost armies. We looked at the loss of institutional memory in the UK Navy, the paratroopers trapped without planes, and the mathematical reality of labor laws that mean an army on paper is only a quarter of that size in reality.
We dug deep into the accounting magic of ESA 2010. We saw how governments are prepaying for invisible jets and engaging in defense arbitrage, valuing 1960s scrap at modern prices just to hit a 2% spreadsheet target. And we explored how that creates a macroeconomic production infarct, driving up inflation and giving us less security for 10 times the cost.
We examined the severe methodological doubts the panel cast on the official threat narratives, likening intelligence reports to Keynesian beauty contests. We recounted the staggering allegation that the entire Putin's dacha narrative was fabricated by the Dutch Prime Minister to cover up a blackmailable minister's affair, highlighting a systemic crisis of credibility.
And finally, we looked at the darkest implications of this perpetual state of crisis. We explored how laws like Article 4.5 bypass GDPR to harvest your genetic and political data. We looked at the integration of Palantir's AI with Gaia X, and we broke down the macroeconomic trap of a programmable digital euro, the threat of negative interest rates, and the slow, inevitable creep of the camel into the tent.
It is a dense, incredibly intricate, and deeply critical perspective on the mechanics of modern state power.
And I want to connect this directly back to your everyday life. It is so easy to tune out geopolitics. It's easy to think of NATO targets and accounting rules as abstract things that happen over there in Brussels or Washington. But this deep dive is fundamentally about you.
Absolutely.
It's about how the money taken from your paycheck is being spent right now. It's about how your privacy, your digital footprint, and your literal biological data are being legislated away in the dark under the banner of emergency readiness. It's about how easily fear is weaponized to manufacture our consent for systems we would never ever agree to if we understood their mechanics.
The challenge the source material presents to all of us is to adopt a new way of seeing. Look past the aggressive, emotional rhetoric on the evening news. Don't just listen to the grand speeches about defending democracy. Follow the actual supply chains. Read the footnotes in the accounting ledgers. Examine the unglamorous, technical legislation being passed quietly in the background while everyone is distracted by the crisis of the day. Because that is where the real physical architecture of our future is being built.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought, something to build on everything we've discussed today. We talked about Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex in 1953. He warned us about the tanks and the rockets stealing from the hungry. But what happens when that traditional military-industrial complex, the one that builds the tanks, merges completely with the modern artificial intelligence and biometric surveillance complex?
It creates a chilling, unprecedented synthesis of physical and digital control.
Exactly. We're no longer just building tanks of iron that sit on a border. We are building invisible, omnipresent systems. Systems that can read our faces in a crowd, analyze our genetic predispositions, track every single digital euro we spend, and predict our political behaviors before we even step into a voting booth.
Yeah.
If the traditional military-industrial complex is a camel nudging its nose into the tent to steal our budget, is the new AI surveillance complex the tent itself? Are we actively constructing the very technological cage we will be forced to live in and paying for it with our own fear? Something to mull over.
A profound and unsettling question to leave on.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly intense journey through the real mechanics of power. Keep questioning the narratives, keep reading the footnotes, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.